Hello.
Good morning, Ivan.
Good morning, Mr. Mainelli. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for your time, for having us. So I would like to briefly introduce you to our audience. Mr. Michael Mainelli is a co-founder and CEO of ZEN Group, the City of London's leading commercial, Team 10 and venture firm, founded in 1994 to promote social advance through the better finance and technology. Mr. Mainelli educated in Harvard, Trinity College Dublin, and the London School of Economics, where he was also as a visiting professor. Mr. Mainelli, thank you for having us, and I would like to move to the questions. So, if you would like to introduce yourself to us and to our audience, we would like to hear you.
Ivan, well, thank you very much, and it is really kind of nice to be on a long line between here and the Ukraine. Basically, my career is a simple one. I spent 10 years doing science and technology, largely aerospace, mapping systems, and other areas of physics. And then I moved into financial services in the early 80s. I spent 10 years doing that. The last 20 years have really just been combining the two interests. So where we find ourselves is the firms who built arguably one of the first distributed ledgers, or blockchains as they call them, back in 1995. I hasten to add we weren't alone. Many people working in this field are unaware that there's a history of the ledgers themselves being much older than the cryptocurrencies and the mining which were added to them around 2009.
Well, no, that's really really shocked to hear that's much kind of information. It's really a big honor to be in chat with you. So I would like to move to the questions. So the first questions: you are the CEO of ZEN, the research and consulting center for blockchain technologies. Please tell us about the consulting work of your company and what are the objectives and the goals, and who are your customers?
Okay. Well, ZEN was founded really with three lines of work. Firstly, we do think tank research. That's done typically under what we call long finance, which is a group of people who've spent over the last dozen years looking at when will we know our financial system is working. We're quite famous there for bringing out the Global Financial Centers Index, the Global Intellectual Property Index, and others. The second area is that we do a lot of venture work ourselves. So when we need to incubate something and spin it out, then we're prepared to do so. And thirdly, we undertake work for commercial clients. The bulk of our clients are in financial services. I don't think there's a major bank in the world that we haven't done some work for at some point. But we also do a lot of work with exchanges, information services providers, and IT firms in that sector. And on the other side, we do a lot of work on the technology sphere. So we've worked with obviously the likes of Research in Motion, Google, etc. So it just blends our two interests, which is where can technology and finance be reconstructed in better ways to help improve things.
Well, no, that's a really wide field of view for your company, and thank you for such a complete answer. So now, could you tell us about the main highlights of your company and what is the main achievements in the field of your work?
Okay. Well, sticking within the distributed ledger space, which is of interest, we began really building distributed ledgers 20 plus years ago because we found them highly secure for storing data and accessing data amongst numerous organizations. So we had some clients who had some extremely sensitive case management files. So these were files of records on patients, but they needed to be shared amongst 4 different organizations. And so rather than building a central database where they might, for example, be hacked, we decided to put them out onto a distributed ledger, and this turned out to be quite successful. Since then, we've had clients who've been using our distributed ledgers for things such as time stamping. So the government of Alderney uses a Zien ledger in its system called Metronomo.
Oh.
And this is the national time stamping engine. This has been going for over 2 years. We have a lot of clinical assessments. We did over 8 million clinical assessment recordings last year on the data logging side. And we have, for example, a number of clients in insurance. Wholesale insurance is an area where many organizations need to share and work on documents together. What we provide in some ways, if you wanted to be simplistic about it, is it's kind of like Google Docs without Google. So everybody can work on documents, upload them, edit them, stick them back in, and see who did what, when, where, and how. But nobody, unlike Google, controls the central database. Mm-hmm. And it's this removal of the central third party that I think gives these distributed ledgers their commercial power, not their technical ability. That said, one of our areas of research has been to try and get the costs down and the speeds up. So, your listeners may be aware that Ethereum runs at around a 20-second block time, and Bitcoin runs at around 10 minutes. These numbers are changing and people are working at it. But we tested one of our distributed ledger systems last month with the National Physical Laboratory, and we proved we were capable of handling 1 trillion transactions a day. And that's probably the sort of speeds that are needed if we're going to see something like a global identity system, or maybe not a global identity system, but identity systems running globally, where you might be looking at, for example, 7 billion people on the planet using an identity card 10 times a day. And you begin to see where you really do need high speed and high capacity, almost Internet of Things type ledgers. If you move into areas like, for example, autonomous vehicles or drones, the data recording requirements of those are absolutely enormous. An autonomous vehicle will have 9 radars, a LiDAR system, it's chatting to the road, it's chatting to the Met Office, it's chatting to the Highways Agency, it's chatting to GPS, it's chatting to the cars around it, and then bang, it hits something. You're going to want a record of what happened, and that's a huge amount of live data logging that's needed. And I see these are some of the big areas for these ledgers, well outside of payments.
Amazing, just an astonishing amount of work you're doing. We are really looking forward to hear about it at the conference. So I would like to move to the next questions. So about blockchain in common. So for many years you have been teaching blockchain, sharing knowledge about the issue, and how did you become competent in this field? How did the topic arise, and maybe where were your sources of information? Maybe you had a teacher in the early years of...
I'm afraid, at the risk of making it sound trite, distributed ledgers aren't really that complicated. They aren't just databases. So in the days when I was doing computing, there wasn't even a computer science course at Harvard. The term had yet to become popular. So it was, in fact, computing came under one of the applied math courses for memory. And I only took a single course at that time. So it's not about formal training. The basic components that you need to understand are not particularly complicated maths. So you've got cryptography and hashing being the two principal mathematical elements, and both of those can be learned at a level over a weekend by a competent person. And then you move into distributed database structures, and that pretty much constitutes the rest of it. We typically will bring a good programmer into our firm, and within about 2 days find them quite happily using distributed ledgers, because these are just database calls. I find some of the courses that are promulgated to young people a little off-putting, because frankly there isn't that much to learn if you're a competent programmer. If you're not a competent programmer, well, you need to go and do that first. The ledgers themselves are what we call in the computing trade flat files, and flat files are very easy to operate on. So ultimately, it's not a complicated technology. What is more complicated actually are the business and commercial uh, terms. Really thinking through security, thinking through governance structures, thinking, whose commercial interest is it to have a more complicated database when perhaps a simpler one would do. So I find, if any of your folks are out there thinking about taking a blockchain course, if it's longer than a few days, question what's really on that course. Some of the courses I've seen are interesting. They're sort of deep dives into particular types of distributed ledger. But remember maybe two things. One, many of these ledgers weren't here as little as 2 years ago, including the most popular one, Ethereum, at the moment. And secondly, that whether it was Satoshi Nakamoto was one person or two or three, nevertheless, it's fairly evident from most of the trails out there that the system was built in about 4 months. So if one person can build this in about 4 months, how much studying do you need to do before you go out and do it?
Okay. I suspect that after hearing this, there will be much more blockchain specialists in a couple of days, if you say
yes.
so. So thank you for this answer. So I would like to move to the next questions. It's regarding your statement that you are believer that in a few years blockchain specialists will be needed in every company. Tell us in more detail what are the requirements of that kind of specialist today, and what special knowledge are needed. But I think you maybe answered it in a previous question. But anyway,
I'd just make an extra observation, Ivan, that is everybody going to need a blockchain specialist? Well, firstly, you've probably heard me saying distributed ledger repeatedly. Blockchain is the distributed ledger approach typically used by cryptocurrencies. And the point I guess I'm making here is that there are many types of distributed ledgers. So the cryptocurrency blockchains would be unsuitable for the autonomous vehicle or drone applications I mentioned earlier, just too slow and expensive. So I think firms are going to need to be aware of the wider reach and various architectures out there, not going and copying a blockchain and playing with it, but understanding that there are many types of ledger approaches. The second thing is these are multi-organizational databases with a super audit trail. So they're really only of use for organizations that have got a lot of external links to other organizations and need to work together with them closely. All organizations need to work with somebody else. That's not quite what I'm saying, but it's for example, take the insurance sector, where every deal that they do can involve a broker, an underwriter, sometimes multiple brokers, more commonly multiple underwriters, reinsurers, legal experts, claim experts, risk assessors, etc. So all of these documents are whizzing around, and you can see that, oh gosh, we're working with a lot of different people. Even then, I would argue that the distributed ledger expert inside is probably more of a commercial and business person with a good understanding of the technological ramifications of approaches, rather than needing to have deep technical expertise. So a good example for this might be, how many firms today have got an internet expert on their board? Well,
everyone
and no one, if you see what I mean. It's just such a base technology. You wouldn't, going back 50 years, you wouldn't have a paper expert on board. Everybody would know how paper kind of works, at least at the level to run the business. Clearly, if you're running a paper mill or you're running an internet service provider, that's a different thing. But the vast majority of firms, I think, are going to find these distributed ledgers are utilities that they use, and they need to be creative about how they use them, rather than utilities they need to run or build themselves.
Well, it's a great answer, and there's a lot of things to think about. So let's move to the last questions. About the conference itself at ICO Event London that will be held on the October 11th. You will have your speaker slot, and we would like to ask you about what topics are you going to cover at this event, and as previously known, you will cover the ICO prospects as well as post-ICO era and what it's lead to, as well as blockchain.
Yes. Well, I can't claim I've written my talk for a couple weeks hence, but yeah, I'm very interested in expressing some of my thoughts on initial coin offerings or ICOs, and the angle I'm taking is that they are exponential in a number of ways. Exponential in the numbers out there, exponential in their energy consumption, exponential in their money supply algorithm. So I believe that the ICOs are a bubble, and I believe this bubble is distracting from some of the immense good that distributed ledger systems can do for the world. So I'm hoping in some ways the bubble bursts and that the fallout is not too severe and doesn't damage the potential of the underlying technology. It's a wee bit as if, going back to my early internet analogies, people were very concerned about pornography on the internet and then decided they wouldn't use the internet for all the good things that it can do. And so I want to make sure that ICOs are put into context at the conference.
Yeah. Well, great. Our team are very thankful for you to giving this interview to us, and we are really looking forward to have you as a speaker at the conference and to talk with you in person. Thank you very much for your time.
And I too look forward to the conference, Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
You
Thank
too.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye then.